Hey guys, Fox here, and we now know the official results from the USFL and XFL Dispersal drafts. In today's video, we're going to be going over the Arlington Renegades' entire draft recap to see all the players they ended up drafting from other teams in the XFL Dispersal draft. So without further ado, let's get started with the first one being Vic Beasley. This is in alphabetical order. The first one was Vic Beasley, linebacker, formerly of the Las Vegas Vipers. Beasley overall was a huge name to be signed to the XFL, but in terms of his overall production, it was pretty disappointing. He only had half a sack and 3 TFLs this past year, but there is still potential for him to have a rebound year and be a really solid upgrade to this Renegades front seven. But in terms of what he did last year, it was a bit disappointing, but we'll see what he's able to do with the Renegades this upcoming season. Now, the next pick is where things get real exciting because the Arlington Renegades selected Houston Roughnecks All XFL wide receiver Deontay Burnett. Burnett was incredible this past year, being second or tied second in receiving TDs at 6, while having over 350 yards and over 25 receptions. This man was insane. He only had a few receptions, yet was able to do a lot with them. The fact is he's going to be an immediate upgrade, as the Renegades still don't have Sal Cannella back, and the fact is their overall receiving core was pretty weak this past year. So this is an automatic upgrade to their receiving core. It's going to provide a huge boost to their punch on offense. Then the next pick is going to be another huge boost to their offense in Devin Darrington. Devin Darrington was one of the two main running backs of the Orlando Guardians this past season. He finished 8th in rushing yards with 294 total yards rushing. He did also have 85 yards receiving while only having 9 receptions. So he is a threat out of the backfield if they decide to utilize him more than the Guardians did. He also did have 4 touchdowns and a really solid 4.4 yards per carry. Darrington was a very underrated back this past year as because he was on pretty much a tandem with the Guardians where neither of them were insane. He got real under the radar, and this is actually a huge ad, especially when you consider the fact he only played 7 games and put up the stats he did. Definitely a really solid ad for the Renegades. And then the next team is starting off some of the guys that haven't played in the XFL yet. And we're going to start off with Adrian Ely, offensive tackle. He had signed a letter of intent with the Sea Dragons, and the Renegades decided to scoop him up. This is one of those moves where we'll see a few more, where it's the Renegades deciding to pretty much go for these guys that haven't actually played in the league yet. But overall, if you know me, I love offensive line picks. The bottom line is I've always said that offensive line is pretty much where your team either lives or dies. If you have a good offensive line, it can hide a lot of flaws. So I really do like this pick for the Renegades. And then we have another actual running back in Morgan Ellison. Very solid pick. Running back from the Seattle Sea Dragons. He only played in 5 games this past year, yet finished 11th in rushing yards. If he had played 5 more games and finished the whole year, he would have been in the top 5 in rushing yards and pretty much been top 5 in pretty much every stat except TDs, I guess. But his 4.9 yards per carry was really, really good. He only had 2 fumbles, but granted, playing 5 games, 2 fumbles is a bit scary. But the fact is he was proving he was a really good running back. Only 5 games to have 250 yards is a really solid amount to have. His 500 yards in 10 games is very solid for spring football. So overall, when you look at Ellison, very solid pick. 10 separate carries of 10 plus yards on only 52 attempts. So he has a really good way of getting those open field breaking type of runs. Very solid pick for the Renegades. It's going to be a huge boost to their backfield. Him and Darrington should provide a huge boost to that running game. Then we have another receiver that might become a tight end, Seth Green. Currently on roster that the UFL put out, the Renegades don't actually have anyone designated as a tight end. And Green technically has been a tight end before, so I'm assuming they're going to convert him back to tight end. But the bottom line is this is another one of those picks, and you'll see a lot of Roughnecks guys that signed letter of intents went to the Renegades. So the Renegades decided to get Seth Green. He should be able to provide a boost at tight end if Cannella isn't able to come back or decides to go somewhere else, but we'll see. Now we get to the other massive pick for the Renegades. They pretty much had 3 massive ones, and this was arguably the biggest. Ajeen Harris was incredible this past year as he had 5 interceptions, which was first in the XFL. He was an all XFL player. He did also have a forced fumble and a fumble recovery. He had 31 total tackles. He was a huge, huge piece for that Roughnecks defense. And getting him to help your back end is going to be huge for the Renegades. You're talking about a guy that can get turnovers. If you have a ball hawk like that, that's going to be huge. As we all know, winning a turnover battle is one of the most important things a team can do, and getting a guy like Harris is going to be an immediate upgrade for that ability. So, really great selection by the Renegades. Now we get to another Roughnecks offensive line, or another offensive lineman, but another Roughneck as well, Marcus Minor. Again, another guy that hasn't played in the XFL yet, but is an offensive guard. Getting guys up front is a huge help to a team. Very solid pick just because of that. Then we have Christian Morgan, defensive back. The Roughnecks pretty much had a lot of these letter of intent signings in like one batch, and the Renegades just decided to take all the players from there, which makes sense. I think a lot of people look at Wade Phillips as a guy that knows how to get the talent he needs. So I'm not really surprised that they decided to go after some of these guys. Christian Morgan, if he's able to be a legit starter and a good player, he could provide a huge help in the back end along with Harris, but we'll see. And now we have an offensive lineman who actually did play, and this is Chris Owens, offensive guard of the Sea Dragons. Chris Owens was part of a offensive line that was one of, if not the best, well, besides the defenders, pretty much like the best. The Dragons, Roughnecks, and defenders were top three in both categories that really matter to show how good your O-line is, and that's sacks that were allowed as well as rushing yards. The defenders were number one in both categories, but the Dragons were second in sacks allowed at only 11 across the whole year, which is insane. When they were also third in rushing yards, only behind by 7. So there's a good argument they had the second best offensive line. So getting a guy who was part of that is a really solid option. Definitely a really solid player to add up. And then we have Roderick Perry, a defensive tackle the Roughnecks decide to select. Again, one of those where it's he technically hasn't really done anything yet. But if he's able to actually be someone, it's going to definitely be a huge pick overall. So I think that overall was definitely a really solid one. And now we get to the 2 actual draft picks. If you watch my video on the first round, that's where these 2 images come from because, we actually knew the first round from the XFL. With the first overall pick was Lindsey Scott Jr. quarterback. This is a very controversial pick, as I said before. Yes, he did put up incredible numbers at Incarnate Ward his last year, but the fact is that they still have Luis Perez on roster, so it's very weird to draft a quarterback first overall instead of Shakur Pearson. As I said, wide receiver was their biggest weakness, and they didn't address it in the first round. They waited later. Now, they still did get a couple awesome pieces, but I feel like you should have drafted Pearson with this pick rather than a quarterback that you don't really need. Now, unless you don't think Perez is that guy, but considering the fact that with the Generals, he was able to help lead them to a 9-1 record, and with the Renegades, was able to win the title last year. Not really a fan of this pick, but Lindsey Scott does have potential to be a great spring football quarterback. So if they do this right, they can make everyone forget the fact that this was kind of a pointless pick. And then the other pick was the one they got at 4th overall, which was for LaRon Stokes. Another controversial one. While he was tied for 4th in TFLs, I think everybody looked at it as you picked him over everybody else. It does help their D-line problem. Overall, the Renegades, despite being champions, had a lot of weaknesses, and this definitely helps their D-line. But again, it was just a weird pick, but we'll see. So overall, that'll do it for the Renegades. Next video is going to be the Birmingham Stallions draft recap, so be on the lookout for that. Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell, and as always, have a great night.